staff.
Having seen the intelligence, I knew that this was a manipulation of information. It was cherry-picked information, out-of-context information. In many cases, information presented as confirmed when, in fact, it had not been ever confirmed by the intelligence community.
For instance, Kwiatkowski says the OSP touted an attempt by Saddam to purchase uranium for a nuclear weapon, without explaining it occurred almost 15 years earlier when Iraq was a U.S. ally.
It bothered me a great deal, because I saw it to be manipulation. I saw it to be conscious manipulation, not an oversight, but consciously done. That's how it appeared to me.
Another example, a primary source named Ahmed Shalabi, then perhaps the best-known Iraqi expatriate. His organization was paid more than $300,000 a month to provide intelligence to the Office of Special Plans.
Well, come on, you pay somebody $345,000 a month, you're going to get your money's worth, right? He wants to keep the checks coming. He's going to keep telling you things.
How are you, sir? Fine. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you. How are you?
Chalabi, a convicted bank swindler who hadn't lived in Iraq since he was 13, hoped to become the new Iraqi president when Saddam was ousted. His OSP reports were routinely optimistic, predicting American troops would be greeted as liberators.
This is what allowed Iraqi National Congress, Chalabi, reports that have proven to be either completely fabricated or completely wrong, to get to the President of the United States without the proper kind of labels.
We asked ex-CIA Director James Woolsey if intelligence gathering could also be improperly influenced by Dick Cheney's unprecedented 8 visits to CIA headquarters.
Would you accept it as possible that the reaction to that kind of relationship with the Vice President would be what some call stovepiping or cherry picking, where you look for the kind of intelligence you believe they want and give it to them?
Yeah, I suppose it's a possible reaction of someone, but if people reacted that way as intelligence officers, they ought to be removed and replaced by people with backbone.
You don't believe that kind of thing happened in this case with Iraq?
I wasn't present in any of the conversations, but whether the Vice President said something with a frown on his face or a smile on his face, it doesn't matter. It's the DCI, the CIA director's job to encourage his people to call it straight, and it's their job to call it straight.
But former Pentagon staffer Karen Kwiatkowski says that's not what she saw happening.
If you disagree with Dick Cheney, the highly predictable result is you will no longer be working for Dick Cheney.
Indeed, as 2002 became 2003, and the drums of war grew louder, the intelligence quoted by U.S. officials was unanimous. Saddam Hussein was unquestionably a nuclear threat.
Within a 2-week or 3-week period, every senior official began to talk about mushroom clouds. How many believed it? I think most of them did.
When we return, truth and consequences at the White House.
It is essentially the betrayal of our country. It is a treasonous act.
It was January 2003 when George W. Bush went to Capitol Hill to deliver the annual State of the Union address. Everyone knew what his message would be.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program.
This man had an intense personal interest in that speech.
Weapons of mass destruction in the hands of rogue elements and non-state actors is the single greatest threat that we face to the next generation. And so you have to take it seriously.
Joe Wilson is a former U.S. diplomat, an ambassador in Africa, the last American official to meet with Saddam Hussein. A year earlier, when Vice President Cheney got a tip that Saddam had been trying to buy uranium from the African nation of Niger, the CIA sent Wilson to check it out.
And in essence, your conclusion was what?
Well, my conclusion was it could not have taken place. Could not have taken place, did not take place.
Wilson says he told the CIA the Africa rumor was false and assumed that was passed on to Cheney's office.
And in fact, when I came back and gave my report, I thought, well, the Vice President can sleep a little more easily tonight, knowing that there's nothing to this particular report.
The State of the Union.
Imad Kaduri also had a personal stake in that State of the Union address. He now lives north of Toronto. But for years, he was one of Iraq's top nuclear scientists.
America had no idea of the existence of this program. And neither did the Israelis, by the way. They suspected something was going on. But they couldn't get the scope of what we did.
Kaddouri says it was 1981 when Saddam decided to build an atomic bomb. For the next decade, they assembled the equipment, a database, and uranium.
I would estimate we were about 15 to 20% in 1991 of where we should have been to declare that we have a nuclear bomb. Had we been there for 3 more years, plus minus a year, with that accelerated program, we would have been able to obtain the bomb.
But that never happened, according to Kaddouri, because of this.
The nuclear weapon program in Iraq stopped on the first night of the bombing of the Gulf War in 1991.
That night, coalition aircraft flew more than 1,000 bombing runs in Iraq. When they were finished, Saddam's nuclear dream was too.
That's because they actually bombed the nuclear research center at the site where we did our research. Control, the manufacturing, the processing. That was bombed. Therefore, the whole program stopped.
He insists that nuclear program was never rebuilt. Years later, from his new home in Canada, he watched the U.S. mount its case to attack Iraq again.
On the night that I heard President Bush enunciating his clear intention of invading Iraq on the pretext of nuclear weapon program, I was struck by the incredulity of that charge.
Which brings us back to Joe Wilson. Remember, he's the former U.S. ambassador sent to Africa to investigate the tip to Dick Cheney that Saddam Hussein had tried to buy uranium for nuclear weapons. Wilson thought he'd debunked that rumor. Then, in the State of the Union address, he heard these 16 words.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
It was a crucial moment. Now there could be little doubt. Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and he wanted a nuclear bomb.
When you hear the president in that State of the Union address, what possible explanation?
Well, then it became clear to me that there had been a deliberate attempt on the part of some members of the government to deceive the U.S. Congress and deceive the American people, and indeed, given the fact that the State of the Union address is broadcast around the world, deceive the world as to the nature of the threat posed by Saddam's nuclear programs.
Wilson says he tried to convince the administration to retract the statement, then decided to go public himself with this op-ed article in the New York Times. The White House wasn't pleased.
They had a political agenda that included maintaining support for this war, and